So Jean Baudrillard is a very interesting thinker in postmodernism because he represents a nihilism that I think is actually quite unique among postmodern thinkers. You have people like Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, which I think are actually both quite optimistic in the sense that for Foucault, there's definitely a sense of social justice beneath a lot of his stuff, trying to unearth subaltern agency. And in Deleuze and Guattari, there's this push for newness and a schizo-revolution. But Jean Baudrillard accepts a sort of nihilism that a lot of postmodern thinkers don't accept. And this takes him to some interesting places, like it does in Symbolic Exchange and Death, which is what this video is on, obviously. Now, Baudrillard is a strange thinker because his use of language, he's talking a lot about codes and simulacrum and symbolic exchange, of course, and ultimately, Baudrillard thinks that we are in, because like Foucault, and Foucault says this in an interview, actually, I think it was in the late 70s or early 80s, and his question was, who are we and how did we get here? And that's very much what Baudrillard is trying to answer. He's trying to establish what is the postmodern condition, what describes the way that we exist in contemporary society. And for him, kind of going off of the impetus of Guy Debord in Society of the Spectacle, Debord says that, we are absorbed into a kind of mass spectacle of what society ought to be, and we are absorbed in this mode of being that if you watched my For a Critique of Value, I linked this to Heidegger, who's talking about deficient forms of being where we are absorbed in das Man, the they, the amorphous social mass that kind of orients us. And Baudrillard is very concerned with that. He's concerned about a lot of the objectification and alienation of people that Marx talked about, but he is not going to be as favorable to Marx's ideas of kind of a simple class revolution. Baudrillard thinks that, ideas of class and of kind of subaltern voices, of immigrants, of homosexuals, that all of this has been covered over by a code and a proliferation of a model that is going to interfere with our ability to have any sense of revolutionary agency. So we are going to walk through some of Baudrillard's ideas about the code and talk about what is the code for Baudrillard? How does it structure his way of analysis? And how does it help to understand our condition? Because as pessimistic as Baudrillard is, he is able to establish with great literary fullness the condition that we are in today. I'm going to talk in a sec about how I think he preempts TikTok by about 40 years, because this was first written in 1976 and translated into English in 1993. So with that being said, let's just get right into it. Now, one of the things that is guiding Baudrillard is a threat of operationality. He fears the subject being turned into merely an operational sign, because Baudrillard kind of straddles this structuralist, post-structuralist duality, because when he starts and he writes the system of objects, he's very much within a structuralist interpretation. So Baudrillard thinks that identity is ruled by signs, and signs basically take kind of a bare thing and they point to that thing and say what it represents, what it is. We can see kind of representationalism is deeply impregnated inside this structuralist mode of interpretation. So Baudrillard thinks that things do not have essences. They don't have this isness that makes them what they are, precisely because what that isness means, for example, the isness of this water bottle, is in fact determined by its relation to other things. So if you imagine just plopping down this water bottle from a plane onto an island with an isolated, like the North Sentinelese or something, like an isolated tribe, it's unclear that they would use it for the same things we would. Maybe they would use it as a weapon and throw it at each other. Maybe once they drink the water out of it, they wouldn't consider to refill it and continue using it. And partly that is because the bare isness of a thing is tied up in what it means. And what it means is determined by signs. And signs, for Baudrillard, are deeply culturally embedded, such that what this means partly is established by its relations to other things. It is defined as a water bottle by its relation to kind of water economy, where bottled water is sold. And this has a definite relation to an economic mode of being. It has a link to culture, of the fact that bottled water is a cultural banality for us in the West. It's not something we really think about being odd. It's very clear what this is supposed to be used for. But with some imagination, we can imagine really the centrality of signification and the relation of a thing to a larger play of signs, a background of relations that helps establish what something is. And this makes for a tricky analysis because it quickly turns everything into signification. And the problem is, at a certain threshold, this signification has the tendency to make things into mere operations. He talks about industrial simulacra being mere operations, and digitality. And digitality is Baudrillard's idea that things are going to turn not into a code which is able to represent all these different things in a structural interpretation, but rather turns things into a binary code, a digital code, like binary of zeros and ones. And he says digitality is its metaphysical principle, Leibniz is God, and DNA is its prophet. Which is to say that, and you'll know this if you read a lot of literature today in kind of the humanities, there is a tendency to interpret human agency through a genetic kind of understanding of taking account of all behavior through genetic means, that everything is inherited and has a definite being, and that we can take account of sociality by taking account of everything as a binary code. Now, of course, DNA is not a binary code. It's, ACTG. You've got your different sequences that can form DNA. But nevertheless, he's concerned with this imposition of codes upon people. And he says there is a still more radical mutation as regards the code's signals, which become illegible and for which no possible interpretation can be provided, buried like programmatic matrices, light years, ultimately, from the biological body, black boxes where every command and response are in ferment. End of the theater of representation, the space of the conflicts and silences of the sign. Only the black box of the code remains, the molecule emitting signals which irradiate us, networking questions/answers through us as identifying signals and continuously tested by the program we have hardwired into our own cells. So we can see Baudrillard obviously identifying a threat by a code which takes agency and reduces it to this black box of a code. It's not a question of a variety of representation, but rather reduction. So there's an imminence within the code to reduce things to that code, which, of course, we know, and Deleuze and Guattari talk about this a lot in Anti-Oedipus, for example, with the difference between having breasts and the feeling of having breasts, that there's a difference between the thing in itself and the feeling that has been transmuted to the person. We can kind of analogize this here with the code, which is to say there's a difference between the code and the referent with which the code refers to. And Baudrillard's problem is that the referent is covered up by the code. We are now in a proliferation of this very code, irrespective of what it represents. He says the end of the theater of representation. Only the black box of the code remains. It irradiates us and it turns everything into a code, which is obviously a reduction of agency itself, because a code presupposes a system of differences. What does the code mean? Just like we talked about with the water bottle, it presupposes a culture it exists within, an economic apparatus which churns it out, all of the above. So the idea of a code which transcends a culture or transcends materiality is the very form of despotic signification that Deleuze and Guattari talk about, which is to say that the code loses all of its meaning. It doesn't represent anything more other than itself. And that is the problem that Baudrillard is trying to identify, which is that this form of the totalization of the code actually overwrites everything in favor of the code's own proliferation. And relating this back to Marx, of course, has this idea taken from Hegel of dialectical materialism, of history is a determinate rational process carrying itself out and eliminating contradictions and constantly opposing itself, and through the relinquishing of these contradictions and the overriding of these contradictions, history actually carries itself out towards a sort of finality. So it's teleological. There's still an end to which it's going. But Baudrillard says that actually under this code, finality is put into question. He says finality is no longer at the end. There is no more finality, nor any determinacy. Finality is there in advance, inscribed in the code. We can see that nothing has changed. The order of ends has ceded its place to molecular play, as the order of signifieds has yielded to the play of infinitesimal signifiers, condensed into their aleatory communication. All the transcendental finalities are reduced to an instrument panel. And he connects this very later in that same paragraph with a kind of funny idea that DNA equals Adonai. And Adonai is a Jewish name for God. And of course, he's kind of pointing out, it's obviously a stretch that there's an A, a D, and an N in Adonai. But his point still stands that the code is our God now, in a sense. no longer is there teleology, but rather there is a preset finality that we've already reached, in a sense. It's like by reaching DNA, we have reached God. We've not established an open history moving towards God, but rather we have established ourselves in his midst and used it as a totalizing way to talk about ourselves, almost an equivocation of God and the code which overwrites everything in theology. And we can see that it's clear that this establishes a form of communication that's not even really communication. It's aleatory communication, as we talked about. It's not world history carrying itself out anymore, but rather it's an open instrument panel of you put in this input and you get this output. And Baudrillard wants to connect this later to personal agency, to talk about how we have already been inscribed in the code, and we have no destiny other than the code's destiny, which overwrites any sense of communication between a subject and a real world, but rather a subject and an overcoded world, which is signified by this code. Following along the idea of a lost reference, which we can see even playing out, for example, when the US went off the gold standard, and he talks about it in this work, about this fervor that happened when people felt like money lost its referential status. It just all of a sudden became pure fiat value and had no material connection anymore. And of course, it's a pseudo worry. That was already latent within money and within value and representation as such. But this idea of an origin of things through their representation, he wants to say has actually been put into doubt and allows for the proliferation of this code and, in fact, a real violence of capital. He says, in its infinite reproduction, the system puts an end to the myth of its origin and to all the referential values it has itself secreted in the course of its process. By putting an end to the myth of its origin, it puts an end to its internal contradictions. There is no longer a real or a referential to which to oppose them, and also puts an end to the myth of its end, the revolution itself. With the revolution, you could still make out the outline of a victorious human and generic reference, the original potential of man. But what if capital wiped generic man himself off the map in favor of genetic man? And he says capital no longer left the slightest opportunity for a determinate reversal. This is the real violence of capital, which is to say, and he wants to talk about this a lot, and it sounds abstract, but it's actually quite connected to daily life, which is to say that things become a question of capital, a question of the market, because we can think of this in today's society. I mean, you cannot even think about a political goal being attainable unless it's marketable, right? Unless it is profitable. And in the same sense, when everything has been subsumed under this idea of profitability, of the proliferation of the code of capital, of the code of political economy, and he talks about later how political economy, today political and economy are the same thing. And the relinquishing of a myth, an original something to which everything refers to today, the only thing that can be referred to is the code of capital, of the proliferation of capital and wages and commodities And of course, we can see how this idea that everything becomes a circulation of commodities eventually comes back to us, and we ourselves become a form of commodity, which is the very essence of Marx's idea of alienation under capitalism. And in a sense, we can see that just being, again, proliferated here. There is no longer a real or a referential to which to oppose them. Because it used to be in Marxian analysis that we had this real world of binary oppositions, and they will eventually come together in their contradiction and sublate one another, and world history carries on as such. But now, Baudrillard thinks we've hit a point where now we have a code that is so powerful, so all-encompassing, that it in fact is the end of history, like Fukuyama talked about. That now we can be totalized completely within this code, such that there are no more genuine binary oppositions. And this is the most important point that we'll go on to talk about later, but there is no more binaries. There is rather a superficial binary that serves a monopoly of signification. And in terms of a history that has kind of already been laid out in advance, his critique of science is very interesting in this regard. He talks about Jacques Monod, who says Plato, Heraclitus, Hegel, Marx, these ideological edifices represented as a priori were in reality a posteriori constructions designed to justify preconceived ethico-political theories. So, right, this is a basic criticism of phenomenology, that it in fact is not as objective as it thinks, and that we can't bridge the gap from the subject in the head to the world out there, precisely because the world out there structures the way we're even able to talk about the world out there, such that in fact phenomenology will be ridden with its own biases. So, a basic scientific person who's saying, oh, they're too biased, let's go for some sort of objectivity. Monod continues, for science, objectivity is the only a priori postulate of objectivity, which spares, or rather forbids it from taking part in this debate. And we can see in there, Baudrillard is going to go on to respond to this, but we can see for science, objectivity is the only a priori postulate of objectivity. So objectivity is its own postulate, its own justification. We can obviously the tautological nature of this insistence on scientific objectivity creeping in. But Baudrillard says, however, this postulate is itself a result of the never innocent decision to objectify the world and the real. In fact, it postulates the coherence of a specific discourse, and scientificity is doubtless only the space of this discourse, never manifest as such, whose simulacrum of objectivity covers over this political and strategic speech. Which, of course, is to say that we can only really talk about the real by going about this reduction of the real to an object of scientific discovery. And by doing this, we might actually be digging ourselves into a hole, the very same hole of preconceived ethico-political theories. We could just as well think of this as preconceived material theories of representation, which Deleuze and Guattari are very, very critical of. But in the same sense, he's putting science within a discourse, just like Foucault, that in fact it postulates the coherence of a specific discourse, and scientificity is doubtless only the space of this discourse. And we can clearly see the problem with objectivity that Baudrillard is raising, that there is no real or objective outside of a system of signs, a discourse of differences and points that lay out there that allow us to establish meaning through the relation of items in a field. And of course, what do we do if this field has truncated itself? It has been superimposed by a code. And this is the very idea of despotic signification that Deleuze and Guattari are critical of in Anti-Oedipus, when they're critical of the Oedipus complex, of God, of capital, for being these superimposing terms which actually take a whole field of differential flows of all these different interactions and superimposes upon them from on high, from outside of the system, a model. And in a sense, we can see Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari being very close here. And he's going to go on to say, we couldn't put it more clearly. Science itself determines its generative formula and its discourse model on the basis of a faith in a conventional order. And moreover, not just any order, but the order of total reduction. And of course, this total reduction is the total reduction of everything to a scientific code, to an object of scientific discovery. And this might sound like he's just trying to, I don't know, make some sort of naive critique of, oh, science is just turning us into objects. But in fact, it's a lot deeper than that, because in a way, it's similar to Judith Butler's critique of gender, which is that what it means to have a gender, to be a man or a woman, itself presupposes that gender is a binary as such, that being a man is the opposite of being a woman, and that both of those have genuine actual forms. And I mean, if you think about this for 2 seconds, that it seems that we have insisted upon a binary in order to justify such a binary. And in the same sense, I mean, Foucault talks about this when he's talking about what it means to be a subject before the law, or a juridical subject, that we like to pretend, or we like to think, maybe to make it a little bit less, we like to think that the law happens upon a diverse range of subjects that it rules over, and that it is justified ruling over these subjects because of a social contract, or because we agree to be subjects under the law. But in fact, the law creates the subjects which it goes on to rule, such that the subjects of a law are a testament to its own performativity, that it in fact is justifying itself. And he wants to say the same thing with science, that when we try to reduce everything to genetic, man to the genetic man, or whatever, or people to genetic people, that in fact we're doing ourselves a disservice, because we're turning people into something with a definite significatory identity which transcends their material terms. Just in the sense that we can imagine what it means to be a man or a woman is going to change through your culture, through the way same-sex relations are viewed, whatever it may be. And the same reason that we could go against the gender binary because of that very subjectivity of the binary, we could do the same thing with this idea of overcoding. The code is rather quite arbitrary, because in fact, it is going to orchestrate the subjects and rather transform the subjects into something codable. And this is going to, of course, connect to the modern condition. And he goes on to say that science explains things which have been defined and formalized in advance, and which subsequently conform to these explanations. That's all that objectivity is. The ethics that come to sanction this objective knowledge are just systems of of defense and misconstrual that aim to preserve this vicious circle. As Nietzsche said, down with all hypotheses that have allowed belief in a real world. And I mean, he's laying it out very clearly in unusually clear language, because usually, he's talking about discursive and significatory and matrices and all this, but now he's just like, this is what objectivity is. It's defining and formalizing in advance such that the system appears to be in line with the field that it comes to preside over. And in fact, we can see that the proliferation of the code is due to the way the code transforms the field and creates a system of defense and misconstrual. So in fact, the code is utilized such that it is defensive. It is going to create these lines of defense that are going to make it difficult to counter because it creates vicious circle. This is similar to territorialization in Deleuze and Guattari, where we have these singularities that get territorialized as something eternal, as something that stands beyond, and then they get kind of covered up with sequential lines of code that codify something and make it appear objective. Here we have the same thing. The objectivity is merely a system of defense created, like Foucault would say, for the purposes of power and for the purposes of consolidating the enemy, so to speak, such that it's easy to be ruled over. Moving into the section, this is a sub-paragraph of this whole essay, The Order of Simulacra, titled The Tactile and the Digital. And here he's really laying out the digitizement of the modern subject, of becoming a proliferator of this code. Not just a subject which the code overwrites, but a proliferator of that code, which gains their identity through their relationship to the reproduction of the code as such. He says, we live in a referendum mode precisely because there was no longer any referential. Every sign and every message, objects of functional utility just as much as fashion features or any televised information, polls, or discussions, is presented to us as a question/answer. The entire communications system has passed from a complex syntactic structure of language to a binary system of question/answer signals, perpetual testing. Tests and referenda are, as we know, perfect forms of simulation. The question induces the answer. It is designated in advance. The referendum, then, is only an ultimatum. The unilateral question is precisely not an interrogation anymore, but the immediate imposition of a meaning which simultaneously completes the cycle. Every message is a verdict, delivered like the verdict of polling statistics. The simulacrum of distance, or indeed of contradiction, between the two poles is nothing but a tactical hallucination, like the reality effect on the interior of the sign itself. And this is perhaps one of the key paragraphs. I read the whole paragraph because the entire thing is so important for understanding Baudrillard's thought as a whole, which is to say that there is no more reference anymore. When a system or a code becomes sufficiently powerful enough, it is able to overwrite and absorb everything. And Foucault is leveling a similar criticism of power as such, that we are totalized under power vis a discourse. But of course, Baudrillard is leveling a very particular criticism that now we live in a referendum mode, which this is actually pretty similar to, of all people, Muammar Gaddafi, who in the Green Book talks about the idea of plebiscites and the idea of voting, and he says that, in a sense, voting yes or no in a vote is a breach of the citizens' ability to have their views represented precisely because they can only say yes or no. Which is to say, when voting becomes a binary concern, in a sense, just as he said, tests and referenda are perfect forms of simulation. The question induces the answer. It's designated in advance. It's an ultimatum as such. It simply sets out a decision and says, pick one. I've already picked for you. Have fun pretending like you controlled this. And of course, this is very nihilistic, but it's something that we all feel today, particularly in the US political sphere. I know, talking with people about the upcoming election in 2024, everyone's like, it's probably going to be Trump versus Biden. And I really don't like either of them, but I'll choose the lesser of two evils. It was the same thing with Hillary versus Trump. And I mean, in a sense, it already has been with Trump versus Biden, as it was like, we don't like Trump, but like Trump was kind of crazy, so now we're going to vote Biden, and it will probably go the other way in the 2024 election, unfortunately. But who's to say? But this is precisely the point, that in a sense, how much control do we really have over our political system insofar as really we have this code of bureaucracy overcoding all of our abilities as subjects as such in the US today, or anywhere really, precisely because of, Western hegemony and particularly US hegemony in the world today, that we really don't have communication. I mean, just as he said before, that there's a sort of aleatory communication going on. And this is precisely why Baudrillard is so powerful, because he is leveling a critique of the distance that is created between the code that controls society, whether this is the code of bureaucracy, of capital, of genetic, molecular understandings of man or woman or whoever it may be, that in fact, the distance between this code and the things that are overcoded, that proliferate this code, creates a sense of alienation, precisely because we are merely perpetuators of this code. I mean, it's an ultimatum, like we said already, that discussion is turned into an issue of question and answer in an effort to kind of hyper-communicate, to hybridize and streamline communication. We turn it into surveys. I mean, for example, YouTube, every few ads, you will get a survey at the beginning. The fact that I can remember the music of the ad is a testament to its proliferation in our lives as perusers of YouTube. But your position in YouTube is deferred to how do you respond to surveys and the aggregate of your YouTube viewership data in an effort to control you through a code of consumerism and of overriding you as not a person, but as a statistical aggregate. So in a sense, I mean, not in a sense, in a very real way, Baudrillard is signaling a relinquishing of our agency today. And this is so interesting because I can't be the only one who thinks that this really embodies TikTok, because TikTok is such a phenomenon today. I mean, it structures a lot of the critiques of the modern world because of its kind of predatory algorithm. not like sexual predatory or anything, but it just is very adept at identifying trends in viewership and responding to those as such by altering one's For You page. And, a lot of people critique TikTok because of some of the reasons that I think Baudrillard heralds here in Symbolic Exchange and Death. He says contemplation is impossible. Images fragment perception into successive sequences and stimuli to which the only response is an instantaneous yes or no. Reaction time is maximally reduced. The film no longer allows you to contemplate it, it interrogates you directly. And of course, he was talking about film here before and kind of the manipulation that occurs going from plays to the film, where the camera kind of establishes your ability to be intimate with the scene, which I'm a little critical of this myself. He quotes Walter Benjamin, who says, this permits the audience to take the position of the critic without experiencing any personal contact with the actor. The audience's identification with the actor is really an identification with the camera. Consequently, the audience takes the position of the camera. Its approach is that of testing. There's this sense of like, oh, let's get back to the way things used to be, that like we used to be able to have real contact. But I think it would be a mistake of the work that Baudrillard has done to try to look at things like that, let's get back to, he even talks about in Simulacra and Simulation, in the link between information and the media. It's I've done a video on it, on Baudrillard, on meaning, and he's like, we want to get back to like grassroots, like pirate radio and stuff like that, but that's not going to get us out of the hole that we're already in. So maybe you could say like, oh, the good old days when we weren't totalized by the code, but nevertheless, we are within it now. And Baudrillard's problem is that once we hit that point, we can't go back. And we can see the perplexion of the subject in the contemporary world when contemplation does become impossible, because images, we don't merely have this tacit relationship with the media that we entertain, whether this is kind of the breaking news media, or whether this is TikTok, or whether this is Twitter. These are all very particular forms of the relationship between information and the meaning that is gathered from them. Think of the wide ways that you can communicate with someone on the internet. You can do it with Snapchat, which has this form of streamlined communication kind of built into it. You don't save messages, they go away, and it's just about keeping in touch to this minimal extent. And in a sense, we can see Baudrillard was really right when he was talking about the idea that reaction time is reduced. The job of these forms of totalizement is to, as best it can, get to know us through an algorithm of some sort, in an effort to get an instantaneous response out of us, an instantaneous yes or no. And some may say like, oh, like my TikTok For You page or my YouTube recommended, it gets me so well. It knows what I'm gonna do before I can do it. There was this story, it was in a Vsauce video of all things a long time ago, but Target was sending this lady coupons for like baby supplies, and she was like, what are you doing, Target? Why are you trying to influence me to, like, are you trying to make me want to get pregnant or whatever? Is this some form of like control where you're trying to just like push something on me because you like think I'll get pregnant or whatever? Like, how dare you? And then she responds with a sorry note like a month later, and she was like, oh yeah, this whole time you were sending me stuff, I was pregnant and I didn't even know it. So it turns out Target had a sort of algorithm of this is stuff women usually buy prior to them being pregnant. And it could predict this pregnancy with like a surprisingly like above 50% accuracy. And Target knew that she was pregnant before she was. And of course, the whole point is that's the ideal situation of capital and of this totalizing control, that it knows us better than we know ourselves, right? And we are in an ideal situation of control by media, politics, the economy, God, whatever it may be. We are reduced to an instant stimulus of, I am this. How did you know? Oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was. It's kind of like when Deleuze and Guattari are talking about like the psychoanalysts' ideal response from the person being analyzed is like, oh, it was Oedipus all along. Thank you for telling this and revealing it to me. And of course, we can clearly see this is a code that has been imposed and has established its own, like before, it's established its answers and designated them in advance. But because it's so totalizing, it almost overwrites our identity and turns us into consumers or whatever it may be. And connecting this back to elections, like before, he says that the electoral sphere is in any case the first large-scale institution where social exchange is reduced to getting a response. Thanks to these simplified signals, the electoral sphere is also the first institution to be universalized. Universal suffrage is the first of the mass media. And he goes on to say, this phase of political hyperrealism is characterized by the necessary conjunction of the two-party system and the emergence of opinion polls as the mirror of this alternating equivalence of the political game. And the idea of a political game sums this up very well. Baudrillard is not the first one to be like, oh, politics is a game or whatever. Like, we don't actually have control. You can run the prisoner's dilemma game problem on voting to see that your vote doesn't matter anyways. But Baudrillard's point here is that this sense of social exchange, we can imagine a time before this mass proliferation of media where if you wanted to be politically involved, you went to interested citizen organizations. Maybe you joined some kind of political party. We had a thriving socialist party here in the 20s and I think in the early 30s as well. Got something like 20% of the presidential votes in 1924 or something like that. You'll have to fact check me on that. But regardless, in an era before this kind of streamlined communication, there was this semblance of social exchange. And of course, in fact, this still wasn't free exchange. This exchange was still ruled by, who is in power to decide who gets to be voted, who gets the choice of being voted in the first place. You have lobbyist organizations and all this stuff. It is not a simple relation between the voter and that which is being decided and voted over. But at least at a point, there was this semblance of a relation. But with the electoral sphere, it turns into merely a question of getting a stimulated and simulated response. It's a question of responding to polls and simplifying signals, that signal in this case being the voting subject, being reduced to an elector. And then humans become universalized as voters, and they can be aggregated, of course, into a system where their opinions, in a sense, have already been decided by this larger political order that goes on top of them. And the way that Baudrillard links the code and the proliferation of this code to pop culture and the masses is really quite profound, because I think, like, Symbolic Exchange and Death, the first essay in here is like a little confusing, but the Order of Simulacra, here it really opens up and we start to see the relationship between what he's trying to say and the condition that he's trying to respond to and explain. He says, the same goes for public opinion, where what matters most is that it grows incessantly in its own image. This is the secret of mass representation. Nobody need produce an opinion anymore, but everyone must reproduce public opinion, in the sense that all opinions are swallowed up in this kind of general equivalent and proceed from it thereafter, reproduce it, or what they take it to be, at the level of individual choice. For opinion, as for material goods, production is dead. Long live reproduction. Which is to say that, and I mean, this is something that Heidegger preempted as well, talking about we shrink back from the great mass as Das Man shrinks back from the great mass, and we read and respond to literature the way Das Man, the kind of amorphous mass, responds to these stimuli. And in the same sense here, pop culture is really Das Man. It's an amorphous social mass which covers over all of our decisions, even once we have these binary decisions which really have been given to us. We don't decide necessarily what we decide over. What we decide over is put in front of us, and then we make a binary decision. This is kind of a typical determinist opposition to the idea of free choice. But with public opinion, it is incessantly reproducing its own image. It is not reproducing a particular subject or necessarily even a particular viewpoint. I mean, we can see this today with like TikTok dance trends. It's not a question of proliferating a particular dance or even a particular person. I mean, people like Charli D'Amelio will fade off into the annals of history, and people like that will come into and come out of existence in history quicker and quicker as the code becomes more totalizing and more able to respond to our every stimuli. Because in a sense, we can think of this proliferating or prolonged sense of production where think about Elvis. Elvis was popular for a very, very long time, as was Michael Jackson. And this is kind of, popular culture is starting. But both of these people are admired, not only for, strictly speaking, their talents, but for their demeanor, for the spectacle that they create. When we think of like halftime shows today, it's as much a question of spectacle as it is of artistry. And this doesn't necessarily reduce one's artistry, but it does open up the idea that celebrity is not merely, of course, celebrity is not merely this objectivity of who's a good artist, who's a bad artist. It's all tied up in this spectacle of what do we want to emulate? What are we being shown that we ought to emulate that we didn't really decide we wanted to emulate, but is there anyways? And like Baudrillard says, you don't produce an opinion anymore. You merely reference your opinion to pop culture and you let it guide your decision, even subconsciously. And this really pokes a hole in agency, precisely for the same reason Heidegger's idea Das Man does, because we are only in relation to a social field. And that social field has such profound impacts on what it means to be us, that when the code that controls that social field gets large enough, we become agents of the code itself. Instead of becoming humans, we become proliferators of reproduction, agents of reproduction. We don't become, Gavin or whoever's watching this video. It becomes content creator, viewer. It's this aggregate of agency that occurs. Now, here Baudrillard goes into questions of representation, and this is a continual critique across postmodernism, is a critique of representationalism. This idea that something is in relation to an isness that stands outside of it. So, for example, this water bottle is in reference to it as it came out of the factory. And we could say, specifically, to talk about this water, we could talk about it being a used water bottle. And the idea of it being used is in reference as a representation to a more perfect form of the water bottle, the new water bottle, the water bottle as it was before it interacted with the social sphere. And this idea of before it interacted with the social sphere is caught up with this idea of representationalism, that we can get outside of the social and we can just have objectivity as it is. But of course, Baudrillard is trying to put a hole in that. And Baudrillard wants to further carry home this idea of a performative internal logic when he says, the internal logic of these processes, statistics, probabilities, operational cybernetics, is certainly rigorous and scientific, yet it somehow doesn't get any purchase on anything. It is a fabulous fiction whose index of refraction in, true or false, reality is zero. This condition is all that gives these models any force, but the only truth it leaves them comes from paranoid projection tests of a caste or group, undecidability dreaming of a miraculous adequation between the real and their own models, and therefore an absolute manipulation. And this hits on the point that he was talking about before, which is that the code relies off of already having pre-coded entities in front of it, which in fact it has already been involved in creating prior to itself. Because of course, a code comes out of a pre-established order, but as that code comes on the scene, it comes to change what it means to exist in that political order or that social order or that economic order. I mean, you cannot live in the US without being structured by the symbolic order imposed by Amazon or Google, or, I mean, these are real totalizing forces, which even when it appears that you get out from under them, I mean, you don't. I remember a HelloFresh ad, and it had this woman with this real soft, soothing, low voice, and she's like, dinner, a chance to unwind and get back to yourself. And this ad was romanticizing dinner in order to sell you HelloFresh dinner. This dinner that, in a sense, turns you into a consumer precisely by fetishizing the idea that you're not a consumer, that you can get outside of consumerism. It is a totalizing model that really interferes with your ability to be anything other than a statistical aggregate, a probability in a probability density. And as such, this code, it doesn't really get purchase on anything. The image that you get, for example, through Instagram or Twitter or Snapchat, obviously this is a husk of the person it represents. But what happens when the person on Instagram is as real as the person in real life? What happens if you become an Instagram model? Instagram and your image through Instagram becomes just as profound for what it is to be you as does the real you. When codes and models become sufficiently wide in their breadth and scope, They in fact totally transform the social field such that the field becomes a model of codified reproduction, of significatory reproduction, such that, like he says, it's undecidability dreaming of a miraculous adequation between the real and their own models. It's absolute manipulation. As he goes on and talks about more about opinion polls, which, I mean, we use opinion polls up until the moment that the president is announced here in the US and all across the world, is we're constantly looking at these live pollings on CNN or whatever to see like, oh, who has the majority vote, who has the electoral votes and whatnot, what are the swing states that are in, up in arms right now, and how is it going to play out? And we, in a sense, become complicit to a reducing ourselves to our opinions, which have, in a sense, already been laid out for us to choose between. It's an opinion we have the choice to decide which form of coercion we want to choose. He says, talking about opinion polls and politics, it is the burlesque spectacle of the hyper-representative, that is, not representative at all, political sphere that people savor and sample through opinion polls and the media. There is a jubilation proper to this spectacular nullity, and the final form that it takes is that of statistical contemplation. Such contemplation, moreover, is always coupled, as we know, with a profound disappointment, the species of disillusion that the polls provoke by absorbing all public speaking, by short-circuiting every means of expression. They exert fascination in proportion to this neutralization through emptiness, to the vertigo they create by anticipating every possible reality in the image. And this is, again, maybe this is just happenstance of I just happened to link these thinkers together, but Muammar Gaddafi too talks about this crisis of representation. And Muammar Gaddafi says, no representation in lieu of the people. And he's critical of representative democracy because of this, because in fact, you cannot take people and use yes or no opinion polls and voting to truncate the social mass into a mass of elective representatives and actually be able to represent the people. You necessarily truncate all the views of people, and of course, majority rule is minority coercion. I'm pretty sure Locke said that or something. Gaddafi says a very similar thing in the Green Book. But the point, and Baudrillard talks about this too, with the idea of the hyper-representative, that you are representative through your simulacral self as it exists in the opinion poll and in media and in statistical representations of your views and your desires based on your socioeconomic demographic and all this. Hyper-representation is not representative at all. It's representing a statistical contemplative form, an empty form. He refers to this as the species of disillusion. And it absorbs public speaking. Like we talked about before, it takes conversation and turns it into a binary opposition between yes and no, true or false, and in fact reduces us to a sort of agency that takes us out of ourselves to an agency we don't even really recognize anymore. It short circuits every means of expression that we become truncated in, like for politicians, you are not a person. You're a statistical aggregate. You are a probability and a probability density of how will this sentence be perceived by people based on aggregates of information about, we can see that like your browsing information, there are illicit black market companies who will literally just take your browser history on Safari or Google and will sell it to the highest bidders, of course, to solidify this sense of control and overriding you as anything other than a marketable statistic. And that is something I think we can all relate to today, of being turned into a neutralized anticipatory image. Now here, Baudrillard is situating himself indirectly in a lot of postcolonial discourses, because a big thing that postcolonial critiques are trying to get at is that when the colonist becomes a totalizing force in the lives of someone who's been colonized, their agency, whether this is through their ability to have their opinions heard, or whether this is the ability for them to have effective political control or revolutionary control, that these are truncated and absorbed by the model of colonization. And considering that Baudrillard has already talked about the idea that the code comes to anticipate and decide the responses and answers in advance, we can see that this creates a great problem for us if we are sufficiently inside of this. And he says that we are coming up against a paradox where everything is irremediably short-circuited and lost, and that sociology, psychoanalysis, ethnology will be able to have this apparent development where, we'll be going, oh, it was Oedipus all along, or yes, I'm a savage, thank you for telling me, or, it's this sort of patronization of those in the lowest position of the symbolic order. And really, he is going to cement his relation to Foucault and really also to Judith Butler, maybe more than Foucault, that a discourse is tautological. He says, such amazing development is just hot air, however, since the circular response of those polled, the analyses and the natives, is nevertheless a challenge and a victorious revenge. When they turn the question back on itself, isolating it by holding the expected mirror image response up to it, then there is no hope that the question can ever get out of what is in fact the vicious circle of power. It is exactly the same in the electoral system, where representatives no longer represent anything by dint of controlling the electoral body's responses so well. Somewhere everything has escaped them. That is why the controlled responses of the dominated are nevertheless somehow a genuine response, a desperate vengeance which lets power bury power. And this is perhaps a very sad and nihilistic place to be in, precisely because we have this victorious revenge of the model, where it is using its own agency to transform agency as such in a discourse to suit its means. One becomes a consumer. One becomes a proliferator of pop culture, even without really trying nowadays. I can't help but saying that even if I like this turtleneck, I was also influenced to wear it by the fact that I think that it would be appropriate to be seen on YouTube, or something that I feel confident in because of its relation to fashion in popular culture. And this can speak miles to like the recurrence of like retro fashion today. And this becomes terribly sad when, of course, we're connecting this to ideas of representation in representative democracy. you can be honest here. When is the last time you feel that you have actually been represented in politics? This is part of the allure of Trump and his kind of right-wing populism, is just the same as Nixon. He's trying to uncover this kind of silent majority that feels neglected by the political order. And the real ruse of that kind of politics is that we have always, as a society, as a voting populace, been ignored by the political order, which, I mean, anyone knows this with the kind of stingy politician stereotype that ultimately a politician is trying to be reelected. And your vote matters. I want you. Uncle Sam only wants you insofar as you can help protect its colonialist desires and its desire for hegemony. And in the same sense, politicians only care about you insofar as you are a statistical aggregate, a probability that can ensure they remain in power. So here, power is burying power. And always you are being alienated as a subject, that everything has been escaped, and that your response has really been controlled in a sense already. And here, Baudrillard really embodies a critique of democracy that should be taken seriously, not because the majority as such doesn't mean anything, but precisely because what it means to be the majority is to be overwritten, so to speak, by something out of one's control that always seems to slip from one's grasp. It seems to be something that you feel like you had a connection to at one point, but now has been lost. Baudrillard says, the symptoms of the advanced democracies become stable through the formula of the two-party system. The de facto monopoly remains in the hands of a homogeneous political class, from the left to the right, but must not be exercised in this way. This is because single-party rule, totalitarianism, is an unstable form, which drains the political stage and can no longer ensure the feedback of public opinion. The minimal current in the integrated circuit that constitutes the transistorized political machine. The two-party system, by contrast, is the end of representation, since solicitation reaches its highest degree in the name of a simple formal constraint, when you approach the greatest perfect competitive equation between the two parties. This is only logical. Democracy attains the law of equivalence in the political order, and this law is fulfilled by the seesawing of the two terms, which thus maintains their equivalence, but by means of this minuscule divergence, allows for public consensus and the closure of the cycle of representation, a theater of operations where only the smoky reflections of the political reason continue to function. Democracy's credo of the individual's free choice effectively turns into its exact opposite. Voting has become absolutely obligatory. If this is not the case de jure, then it is through the structural statistical constraint of the two-party system, reinforced by the opinion polls. Voting has become absolutely aleatory. When democracy reaches a formally advanced stage, it is distributed in equal quantities, 50-50. Voting merges with the Brownian motion of particles or probability calculus as if the whole world were voting according to chance, as if signs were voting. And we can see very clearly in the end of that you are reduced to a sign within a symbolic order, a symbolic equivalence. And this equivalence occurs precisely because of this seesawing that Baudrillard talks about. That in fact, democracy's freedom, it's a freedom of movement between two parties which are not opposed to one another. I mean, if you know anything about US politics, for example, our right-leaning party, the Republicans, are fairly right-leaning. I mean, we have regular, like, Trump referring in his speeches to QAnon and kind of dog whistling to them, which is a very far-right movement. And our left-wing party, the Democrats, is very, very centrist and conducive to right-leaning policies as such. If you compare our kind of Overton window of what is acceptable politically to any other country in Europe, for example, I mean, things like, socialist policies of universal basic income or kind of food stamp kind of stuff, of free university education. I mean, these would be unthinkable in the US politics today. I mean, today we're more, the center of our political consciousness is about banning abortion and trying to get prayer back in schools and stuff like this. I mean, this is the stuff that is seriously considered in US politics today. And of course, the reality is that no political system, whether it's in the US or whether it's outside of the US, is anything other than this homogenous system with a binary that allows itself to proliferate precisely because, like Baudrillard talks about, totalitarianism is unstable because it drains the political stage. And what does it drain the political stage of? The ability to ensure the feedback of public opinion, which is to say that public opinion is a feedback loop for itself, that it takes its own responses and churns out responses that retroactively go to affect your identity as a subject within such a discourse. So it's only logical, as he says, that democracy is attaining this law of equivalence by fulfilling a seesawing, by this appearance of motion, where in fact there is no more motion. It's an empty, aleatory system of control, which Baudrillard rightly shows is something that maybe we should at least be a little concerned about. He says classical universal suffrage already implies a certain neutralization of the political field in the name of a consensus over the rules of the game. I mean, it's a little bit, we could be like, well, are you saying that universal suffrage isn't important? It's like, of course, we want women to vote. We want everybody. We want gay people, women, trans people, maybe even felons. I mean, that's still a question today. But ideally, we would like to think that everyone is deserving of being able to have their voice heard and being important. If we care about people, qua people, then we ought to care about their voter voice. But Baudrillard puts this into question precisely because we're merely making a consensus over the rules of the game that will dominate us. And like we've talked about before, even once you are a voting subject, your yes or no vote, your vote of what you're responding to is not really something you controlled. You're always kind of already behind a process that already seems to have a political order built up that you simply have to respond to and try to change. This is why progressivism always seems to kind of be lagging behind the possibilities, or really the government lagging behind progressivism. It's always like there's something still outstanding to be done. Baudrillard would probably say that this is a consequence of politics merely being a game that we didn't decide over, just like we didn't decide to be part of the social contract. The social contract could be said to have been imposed on us prior to us even consenting to it. He's very precise about the appearance of a binary in this paragraph where he's talked about that totalitarianism is inefficient because it'll collapse on itself. It doesn't have that appearance of your voice being heard, and it will lead to a kind of revolutionary uprising, which will naturally tend towards these kind of despotic signifiers that will go to overcode everything and create the problems that Baudrillard is talking about. But he expands upon the importance of the appearance of a binary when actually it's just a single system. He says, oligopoly, or real duopoly, results from the tactical division of the monopoly. In every domain, duopoly is the completed stage of monopoly. It is not that a political will, state intervention, antitrust laws, etc., shatters the market's monopoly. Any unitary system, if it wants to survive, must find a binary regulation. This does not change anything as regards monopoly. On the contrary, power is only absolute if it is able to diffract into various equivalents, if it knows how to divide in order to become stronger. This goes for detergent brands as much as for a peaceful coexistence. Two superpowers are necessary in order to keep the universe under control. A single empire would crumble by itself. The balance of terror merely allows regulated oppositions to be put in place, for strategy is structural, never atomic. Even if this regulated opposition can be ramified into a more complex scenario, the matrix remains binary. From now on, it will never again be a question of a dual or open competitive struggle, but one of couplets of simultaneous oppositions. And this is particularly brilliant because, again, Muammar Gaddafi says the same thing, that don't be concerned, and we could really see that Gaddafi weaponized this in order to justify totalitarianism, but he's like, don't, this whole idea of class struggle and all this, it's just meant to make the system appear like you have a voice, when in actuality, in representative democracy, you will never have a voice. And as legitimate of a criticism of that as that is, of course, he went on to just turn into a totalitarianism, or a totalitarian guy, and of course then he got murdered, and you can literally look up the video and see it. I've shown it in another one of my video on Gaddafi. But in fact, Baudrillard here is showing that any unitary system, if it wants to survive, must find a binary regulation, which is to say that the existence of a binary merely regulates this gestating monism that already exists. That in fact, a monopoly is already there, but a binary has been brought forth in order to justify regulating. And regulating what? Regulating the ability for that monopoly to be toppled. That monopoly being the symbolic order, the despotic signifier, the code, whatever you want to call it. And of course, the detergent stuff was brilliant. That as much for detergent brands as for anything else, two superpowers are necessary in order to keep the universe under control. A single empire would crumble by itself. And this, in a sense, we can relate this to imperialism, for example, because, as this kind of class consciousness comes about, naturally, empires tend to crumble. People want their apparent agency. So, of course, they wipe off colonial rule. But then, of course, the very pertinent question is, can that colonial rule ever be wiped off? And if the colonial power is sufficiently strong enough, how do you even know if you've ever gotten outside of it? Especially today, like these post-colonial countries that have gotten rid of colonial rule. Think of like Australia, for example. Australia is practically a British exclave of sorts. It is, and that's not like saying that Australia isn't unique, but its culture is so British that it's a question of if it would really exist vis Australia outside of being a post-colonial society. And especially like a lot of African societies, like they are not post-colonial insofar as the world market is one in which they are constricted into a position where they serve as a hub for cheap labor outside of labor laws, where you can make children work long hours in the same kind of conditions that occurred during the Industrial Revolution in the US, for example, and in Britain and across the West. So in fact, a single empire is going to tend to dissolve. But in fact, the fate of these things that have been dissolved, this idea of a free market, is in fact ruled by an empire which merely regulates itself via a binary. I mean, think about how much there's like 5 companies in the US that own like most of all of the capital and all of the media agencies and all the everything. I mean, you've got like Google and you've got Amazon and you've got Walmart. And I mean, these companies, because they're not even people, and that's the thing about it, is that what it means to exist is structured and regulated by what is in fact a binary of 2 competing companies that really come to dominate and control what it is to exist. So in a sense, to be a consumer is to be structured by, in fact, a binary symbolic order. And to finish things off in this subchapter and for this lecture, which has been quite long, he very brilliantly talks about the 2 towers, the twin towers of the World Trade Center back when they existed. He says, "Why has the World Trade Center in New York got 2 towers? All Manhattan's great buildings are always content to confront each other in a competitive verticality, from which there results an architectural panorama that is the image of the capitalist system, a pyramidal jungle, every building on the offensive against every other." So, we've got this sense of competition where the higher the building is, the more the spectacle it is. And you've got, today, like, what country can build the tallest building? And right now it's the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. At one point it was in the US. It's been in various positions at different spots. And this can really be said to represent this sense of competition. But Baudrillard goes on to say, "The effigy of the capitalist system has passed from the pyramid to the punch card. The buildings are no longer obelisks, but trustingly stand next to one another like the columns of a statistical graph. This new architecture no longer embodies a competitive system, but a countable one, where competition has disappeared in favor of correlation." And this relates to Baudrillard's idea that we live in an era not of production but of reproduction, of duplicating this endless duality, which actually controls, what it is to be a consumer. And like, for example, with the World Trade Center, or the World Trade Centers when they did exist, is that it's almost this, he says that the 2 towers of the World Trade Center are the visible sign of the closure of a system in the vertigo of doubling, while the other skyscrapers are each the original moment of a system continually surpassing itself in the crisis and the challenge. There's just kind of this vertigo of doubling and reproduction. It's a kind of industrialist lament of, this could go for humans, that we are reproduced as an image of celebrity, or as consumer, or as a statistical aggregate. So Baudrillard really precisely, I think, as can be seen, is able in Symbolic Exchange and Death, and he does this in other works too, but particularly in this one, is able to explain what does it mean to be within this code. how does it structure one's identity? And how does this create a system that, as much as it is able to adapt to us, changes us into proliferators of a code, into encoding entities ourselves, which are nothing outside of the code which comes to bury power with power, or have power bury power, as he says. So that's it for this lecture. Obviously, there are critiques that can be leveled against Baudrillard. He envisions this very totalizing order that I think Deleuze and Guattari are able to effectively counter and talk about interesting new ways to get out behind. But nevertheless, Baudrillard is a poignant thinker and able to describe our condition with such specificity and breadth. So I really hope this has been useful and has helped you be able to engage in what it means to exist today. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.